So, good day, folks. It's about China. Like I said, China is our current and clear and present day. It's not the same old beast that it was under Deng Xiaoping. It's a new beast under Xi. It's a revanchous beast. It's rapacious. It's hungry. And she's got to outdo Mao, who bought Tibet and the outer periphery with since he compares himself with him. Then he's got to compare himself with Deng, who bought Hong Kong and Macau and back into China. So what's he gonna do? What's he gonna do when they come for you? What's India gonna do when he comes for you? That's the important part. And like I also said yesterday, you can downplay all the territory grab that China's done, try and blame it on Nehru for 1962. But the message you are sending, especially if it's coming from people like the CDS, is that we are weak and China's has sensed sheer panic. And I'll tell you why the panic is. Because he knows that Modi cannot be shown up before the UP elections. He knows that. He knows Modi only wants to focus on Pakistan, which is of no relevance, so that he can create the Hindu-Muslim divide. China, folks, is the real problem. And you better believe it, and especially like this. Colonel Death brings China roll back in focus. A deadly ambush near the Myanmar border in Manipur that killed 5 soldiers, including a colonel, his wife, and their 8-year-old son, has brought China's possible support to insurgencies in India's northeast back in focus. Let me just tell you, it has to be supplied from China. Contrary view by serious government fans rouse seemingly contradictory views within the government of a village built by China in a disputed area in Arunachal Pradesh, and the status of the land on which it sits ignited a political controversy on Friday. Our national security is unpardonably compromised because GOI has no strategy. The Congress leader attacked the government a day after the Ministry of External Affairs, in its first response to a US report of the Chinese referred to Chinese activities in areas it has illegally occupied over the years, and asserted that India will never accept such illegal occupation of its territory. Even as the country's senior-most military commander, General Bipin Rawat, said the Chinese construction were on its side of the LAC. Now, this is shameful to say the least. Army Chief continues to try and do his bit. Army Chief visits Israel to bolster defense relations. Heavily fortified Tawang to get its first cinema theater soon, and that itself tells you a story. By keeping them in the dark, we actually ourselves created a situation where Tawang is kept out of the about feeling Indian, haven't we? Is the India-China conflict intractable, says Manoj Joshi. China's refusal to resolve the border dispute and force Delhi to accept Beijing's primacy cannot be acceptable to India. It cannot. India may be weaker than China, but it is strong enough to ensure that any conflict would be mutually destructive. The situation would have been less intractable if India and China could have resolved their border dispute. But China has shied away from that because it has used it as an instrument for keeping India off balance. And ain't that the truth? And we continue to be delusional. It's 40 some years, man. The bottom line is that Beijing wants Washington to accept it as a peer, and at the same time wants to push New Delhi to acknowledge its primacy in SAIOR. Just as the US rejects the Chinese contention, so too does India, which has a strong sense of its own destiny as a leading nation of the world, if not a great power. All this makes for a situation of intractable conflict, sooner than later. Xi lays way for third term in power at party meeting, like I had told you earlier. And then China's challenge. India must stabilize Kashmir to counter Beijing's multi-pronged strategy in the east. He says in sum, China today is speeding ahead to meet its 2049 target of surpassing US power and displacing American alliances. It's in this context that the current India-China standoff along the LAC needs to be seen. As the report points out, despite military and diplomatic dialogue between the two sides, China has continued to take incremental and tactical action to press its claim along the LOC, including the building of a so-called large civilian village. It could also be a PLA military camp in disputed territory in India's Arunachal Pradesh. Thus, there is no denying that China today possesses the biggest strategic security challenge for India. We are looking at a revisionist, authoritarian power that has the means to try and refashion the global order to suit its own interests, folks. That is what we've got to remember, and that's what you've got to take it to heart and prepare accordingly. Go get back, Kailash Hills, folks. So we got to keep protecting our periphery, right? Nepal, like I said, it's always is somebody that we really have messed around with their domestic politics, etc. And however, they've played us too, right? And they're playing us as far as China is concerned. And we got to keep up. It's got to be a relationship based on reality and not some color-tinted glasses or some religion and the RSS interference in this process, right? And this is what's bound to happen. Nepal's Kala Pani census plan may spark fresh row, so it's not gone away. But good part, Nepal set to sell surplus electricity in India's energy exchange market. Important because it's one of the main exports, and they don't have another market except India and Bangladesh, right? Nepal army chief to visit India in November to boost ties, and this is the most critical relationship India has. Special ties with a special army. For strategic and political reasons, India must preserve institutional ties with the Nepal army. The history is important because of three factors. One, India and Nepal now have an active territorial dispute, and while Kathmandu political class has sensibly toned down its rhetoric for now, the politics of ultra-nationalism could again lead to an escalation. Nepalese army will have a key role in moderating its irresponsible political establishment. Two, as the India-China military confrontation deepens, it is important that NA is sensitive to India's security imperatives. And finally, irrespective of the ebbs and flows in the political relationship, it is important to have an old challenge that is relatively free of the pressures of democratic politics. Important. And then we have the Gorkhas. And Gorkhas form a very strong part of our Indian infantry. And China wants that. We've heard that before. And everybody who's thinking that after the MOU signed between Bhutan and China, maybe China is finally getting its finger into the pie, I would say wait. Play cat and MOU games as Harsh Pant Aditya Shivamurthy, right? Signing a memorandum of understanding with China doesn't make Bhutan India unfriend. It says there is little possibility that Bhutan will move closer to China for its economic incentives, as Thimphu has for long avoided massive economic investments and environmentally unstable projects. This is besides the credibility of China and its investments continuing to die with Beijing's assertiveness and debt trap diplomacy. Finally, since both India and Bhutan enjoy a special relationship and respect the 2007 treaty, it is an exaggeration to believe that Bhutan will establish diplomatic ties with China without informing or discussing with India. Have some faith. Having exposed much of the neighborhood to China's investments and debt trap diplomacy, India is now more committed to preventing the same in Bhutan. The competition isn't just for power and security, but also for prestige. It is likely that this competition for Bhutan will have spillover effects throughout this region, and it will, right? Talks with Dalai Lama, only about his future, not Tibet. Now, Tibet is critical for India, and you'll see why as I read out what Nirupama Rao writes. The centrality of the Tibet question on China, just blaming individuals, especially Nehru, is wrong, right? She says, here's it. Where we faltered was in glossing over the deep linkage of the Tibetan question to the question of India's northern boundaries. India's ties with Tibet are complex, dictated not only by geography but by religion, pilgrimage, trade, and cultural osmosis. And this makes the India-China relationship a three-body problem. In the Himalayas, cultural boundaries transcend political boundaries. They overflow both linguistically and culturally, no matter how much you divide them by various borderlines. The strategic dilemma posed by Tibet in relations between India and China remains far from resolved. Tibet provides the foundation, that centrality of marginality on which both India and China's border claims are based. India's ties with Tibet were old, and Buddhism cemented this closeness. The British had established a presence in Lhasa and southern Tibet from the early 20th century onwards, and India had inherited these privileges, together with the border drawn by the British and the Tibetans in the eastern Himalaya by the McMahon Line in 1940. That border had not been accepted by the Chinese, who questioned the Tibet's right to transact international agreements. Chinese sovereignty in Tibet was acquiesced in, and India showed little inclination to put together an international defense of Tibet's right in United Nations. All this was done to the advantage of a strong and nationalistic China, and not with concern for Tibet. The deterioration of relations between India and China from the late 50s onwards, occasionally differences over interpretation of their shared borders, and the flight of Dalai Lama to India left Nehru with the realization of his misplaced faith in Chinese friendship. It was not as if he had not harbored doubts about Chinese expansionism before this, but he had pitched his tent in an imagined, and we continue to do that, right? Imagined world of Pan-Asian unity led by India and China. That would prove his undoing. Meanwhile, Chinese contempt for Nehru was reflected in Mao's words when he asked, who is Nehru? He is a middle of the roader of the Indian bourgeoisie. The widening asymmetry of power between an ascendant China and an ascending India only complicates such a situation further. Let me say this same thing. What Mao thought of Nehru, I am willing to bet she thinks of our Prime Minister. No matter Puppy and whatever else that went with it in those three what did they call them? Non-summits, right? Insanity, folks, insanity. So the other two bugbears that are going to come into play in our domestic policies are Pakistan and Bangladesh. Pakistan is having huge problems internally, economics, influx of refugees from Afghanistan, and then you remember that crazy fight about replacement of the ISI chief. Pakistan Army and Imran signals from change in ISI. Lieutenant General Nadeem Anjum has been confirmed as ISI chief, finally replacing Faiz Ahmed. In the suspenseful 3 weeks during which Imran Khan faced off against Army Chief Qamar Javed Bajwa on the latter's decision to move out Hamid to a coup, the civil-military needle has lurched once again in Pakistan towards the military. Okay, and as Raja Mohan writes, the tumult next door. Whether it can or should make a difference to Pakistan's internal politics, India must pay greater attention to the internal dynamics of our difficult neighbor. Absolutely. Imran has made bold to challenge the paramount authority of the army chief. While the GHQ is quite capable of pulling down the Imran government, the PM is turning to religious mobilization to secure his flanks. How this plays out will be of special interest to Delhi. Skeptics will, however, say the differences within Pakistani establishment on the policy towards India are tactical and therefore not consequential. Realists might concede that unlike elsewhere in the neighborhood, Delhi's leverage in Pakistan's politics is terribly limited, but it is by no means negligible. Then he writes again, diminished state of Pakistan. Islamabad's accommodation of Tehrik-e-Labik underlines the decades of promoting and pandering that has dramatically shrunk its room for maneuver in relation to Islamist groups. He says, Pakistan's meek surrender yet again to the TLP underlines how hard it is for the state to regain the authority that it has ceded to religious forces. Yet the permissive environment in Islamabad has created for terror has also spawned violence, religious groups that want to fight the Pakistan state. On top of it all, these groups have begun to weaken Pakistan's ties to long-standing partners in the West, such as the US and Europe and its neighbors. The deployment of religious extremism as a policy tool has also invited international sanctions and financial constraints. Islamabad's trajectory is a self-defeating one that is best not taken by others. Sacrificing the state is too high a price for any political formation that wants to rule a nation. And he's also warning our majoritarian party. Right? Pakistan is caught in a trap of its own making, writes Vivek Katsu. It sure is. Someday POK will also join this part of Kashmir, top IF officer says. He must have thrown the cat amongst the pigeons. Drugs from Pakistan worth 300 crores seized in Gujarat's Dwarka district. Watch this out. You got to make sure, because Pakistan, for them, this is a major policy initiative, flooding India with drugs. 5 security die in attack in Pakistan near Afghanistan border amid government TTP deal. This is during that. So nothing is sacrosanctly signed. But OIC team visits LOC, gets briefed by Pakistan military. I don't understand that. Pakistan SC questions PM over peace talks with militants in school massacre case, and so they should. Srinagar Sharjah flight rerouted as Pakistan denies use of its space. In South Asia, the politics of religious extremism. That leaves us with Bangladesh, where secularism hasn't become taboo. If it handles its domestic challenges maturely, it may well cut a path through for the rest of the region. This is Bangladesh, folks. At least 6 dead after banned TLP party's rally turns violent. TLP protesters fire at Pakistan cops with machine guns, says report. No wonder they turned turtle Pakistan. Bajwa has his way. Pakistan names ISI chief. Pakistan Taliban agree to complete ceasefire. That's never going to happen, folks. The political drivers behind the attacks on Bangladesh Hindus. The battle for Bangladesh has started, one that India needs to watch closely. And you've got to be very careful with this. Decoding the rise of Islamist extremism and violence in Bangladesh. India has reacted cautiously because bilateral ties have prospered under Hasina. But most important is, the reactionary action in Bangladesh has to do a lot with India's domestic politics, and we need to keep this region in control. Indian Ocean region nations need cooperative architecture, says Shringley. Important steps to get this architecture of the IOR together on our side, along with money from the United States, France, and the rest of the world. Jai Hind.